Hello everyone, peace be upon you. Before we begin, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe, and stay with me until the end of the story. Also, leave a comment telling me which city and country you're watching from. I'd love to see how far my story has reached. For those of you who have already subscribed, I sincerely wish you good health, ease in all your affairs, abundant blessings, and may all your hopes and dreams come true. Amen. Now, let's begin the story. The Iron Bench Armory at Fort Ridgewell was never truly quiet, but compared to the rest of the base it felt calm. Fluorescent lights hummed. Steel racks stood in straight lines. The floor smelled like oil and old dust. Lauren sat at a corner bench with her M2010 broken down in neat rows: bolt, receiver, barrel, stock, magazine. Her hands moved with steady rhythm. Cloth down the bore. Light oil on the lugs. Inspect, wipe, align. No wasted motion, no show. She believed a rifle deserved respect, and respect looked like this: clean metal and precise order before a single round ever left the chamber. People on base called her the quiet one. She didn't argue, didn't gossip, didn't fill the room with talk to prove a point. She let groups walk past, she let jokes drift by, and she kept her focus on the small things that actually made shots land: clean threads, straight glass, good torque on the rings. A notebook sat open at the edge of the bench, full of numbers and simple notes: wind at 600, drop at 1200, spin drift, small corrections for air density. Nothing dramatic, just math written in a steady hand. The armored door eased open. Boots crossed the concrete, slow and sure. Lauren didn't look up right away. She finished the pass on the barrel and set it parallel to the edge of the bench. Then she glanced over. Nathan Cole stood a few feet away, hands at his sides, eyes sharp like he was weighing the room and everyone in it. No patch that said who he was to those who didn't know. To anyone who did, his posture already said enough. He didn't greet her or clear his throat. He just watched how she laid the parts, how she checked the bolt with her thumb, how she lined the scope cap so they wouldn't roll. His silence felt intentional. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and even. "Do you think you can hit 3,827 meters?" The number hung there. No drama, just a fact placed on the table. Lauren paused for half a second. Then she set the bolt down and reached for the scope. She didn't answer with words. She pulled the scope to the light, checked the glass, rolled the elevation turret through its clicks, and reset it. She wrote a tiny note in her book, just a reference line, and kept moving. Nathan stepped closer. "Not asking if you want to. I'm asking if you can." No challenge in his tone, no taunt. Just a serious question from someone who understood what that distance meant. Long flight time. Big drop. Wind that changes between ground and sky. Small mistakes that grow large. Lauren reassembled the bolt and slid it home. The click was clean. She checked action screws with a torque wrench. She leveled the scope on the bench bubble and nudged it until it settled. She glanced at him once. He didn't blink. "Echo Valley Range," he said. "Nevada Test Range. Dawn window. We're running an experiment, not a show. Colonel Whitaker wants data he can stand on. Dylan Price will spot. Mason Reed will handle ammo checks. Lieutenant Grace Holloway runs atmospherics. I'll be there, but I won't touch your rifle. We need discipline more than talk." Lauren's face didn't change. She flipped to a fresh page. Temperature estimates for dawn in the desert. Likely air density. First light mirage. Wind at 2 meters versus wind higher up. She boxed the number 3,827 and drew a thin line under it. Not a promise, just a target. Across the room, a pair of privates laughed about something unrelated and pushed through the door. The sound bounced once and died. Lauren tightened the ring caps in sequence and checked eye relief. She dry-cycled the action twice, then set the rifle back down. Nathan watched her hands the whole time, like he could read a shooter through how they did simple things. "Wheels up tonight," he said. "Camp Horizon, lights out early. First look at the plate before sunrise." She nodded once. No questions about credit. No questions about who else had tried. That wasn't her lane. Her lane was preparation. She wiped the stock where sand would try to cling, packed the kit in the same order every time, and rubber-banded her notebook so it wouldn't open in transit. Down the hall, a cart rattled. Somewhere outside, a truck braked hard and hissed. Inside the armory, the light buzzed and the bench stayed clean. She ran through a final checklist: bolt face clean, bore film thin, screws to spec, turret 0 confirmed, and closed the case with a solid latch. Nathan shifted his weight like a decision had landed for him too. "Dawn," he said. "No speeches." Lauren slid the case off the bench and stood. For a breath, they just faced the rows of steel and polymer together. It was simple: either the math and the shot lined up, or they didn't. No middle ground at that distance. She tucked the notebook into her pocket. The pages pressed against her leg, a reminder that numbers mattered more than noise. On her way out, she hit the lights over her bench and left the rest of the room as she found it. Nathan fell in a step behind without trying to walk beside her. In the corridor the air felt cooler, and the bass carried its usual mix of footsteps and short orders and clipped radio calls. She moved through it like a steady line. At the flight line, the sun was sliding down behind the trees, the sky going pale. A crew chief waved them toward the transport. Dylan was already on board with a long case and a spotting scope bag. Mason had a plastic tote marked with lot numbers and notes. Grace set a small sensor case under her seat and nodded at Lauren like they'd met in the field a dozen times. No one asked if she was ready. They didn't need to. She set her rifle case down where it wouldn't bounce and sat across from Nathan. The ramp came up, the engines rose, and the base fell away into dark shapes and lights. Lauren closed her eyes for a second and pictured the target plate as nothing more than a small rectangle at the edge of clear vision. She pictured the flags on the poles near the berm. She pictured the hold, the break, and the quiet after. Not a heroic scene, not a headline, just a clean line from cause to effect. When she opened her eyes, the cabin lights were dim. Dylan checked his scope tripod feet. Mason reviewed notes about powder temperature sensitivity. Grace scrolled through last week's wind logs. Nathan stared at nothing and everything. Whitaker would be waiting on the ground. The aircraft leveled out. The engine noise set a steady backdrop. Lauren pulled her notebook and penciled a new line under the box she'd drawn. Dawn window. Calm air first. No rush. Verify. Commit once. She put the pencil away and let the book rest in her lap. There was nothing to say. The work would speak in the morning. The aircraft touched down on the Nevada test range before midnight, the ramp dropping to a pale wash of floodlights and cold desert air. Camp Horizon sat a few hundred yards off the strip, tents, antennas, tables with Pelican cases stacked in rows. Whitaker met them with a clipped nod and a look that said schedules mattered more than greetings. Brief words, a quick timeline, lights out by 2300. First look at Echo Valley Range well before dawn. Lauren stowed her case under a cot and kept the notebook in her hand. She set an alarm, lay back in her boots, and let the hum outside fade. When the alarm buzzed, the tent air was still and cold. She zipped her jacket, grabbed her kit, and stepped into a black sky barely holding a thin line of gray on the horizon. Dylan was already outside with the tripod slung over his shoulder, Mason carrying a tote, Grace closing up a sensor case. Nathan fell in without comment. A utility truck took them down a dirt track to the firing line, a low berm cut into sand. Beyond it, the dark rolled out for miles. They set up under red light. Dylan locked the tripod, checked the plate markers through glass, and called rough bearings. Grace booted the console, wind, temperature, pressure fed into a simple display. Mason laid out ammo, each round checked for neck tension and overall length. Lauren knelt, popped the latches on her case, and worked through a quiet pre-check, action smooth, turrets zeroed, rings tight, bipod firm, bag under the stock. She didn't rush. The only clock that mattered was the small air window right after sunrise, when mirage was low and wind was usually honest. Whitaker stood back with arms folded, tracking the process. "We've got 2 hours of usable light before this place turns into a convection lab," he said. "We're not chasing a record. We're validating a profile. Clean shot or no shot." The first edge of sun cleared the ridge and exposed the range in flat gold. Flags along the route lifted, then settled. Grace read numbers out loud, temperature creeping up, pressure steady, humidity dry. Lauren tuned the parallax, watched the shimmer start to twitch, then settle. The plate was out there as a glint and a suggestion, smaller than it had any right to be. "Wind 2 at ground, trending east," Dylan murmured. "Upper layer unknown. Mirage light to moderate." Lauren didn't load. She watched the flags again. A small gust moved the closest streamer left, then right, then went neutral. That was the first warning. Unsteady air this early meant the day was going to be jumpy. She adjusted elevation through the long stack of clicks, held wind in her mind, and waited. Then the first window opened, 30 seconds of nothing. She eased around in, settled, exhaled. 30 seconds turned to 10. A ripple ran down the flags at the middle distance. Not bad, but not clean. She took her finger off the trigger and let the window pass. Behind them, a pair of range hands exchanged a look that said they'd expected a shot. Whitaker didn't say a word. Nathan glanced at his watch and then at the flags, same conclusion, not worth burning the attempt. They reset. The second window was worse. Ground wind read at 2 again, but the shimmer over the far heat line started to pulse, a sign the upper air had begun to fight a crossflow. Grace called a slight directional change. Dylan adjusted his numbers and shook his head. "It's not lining up," he said quietly. By the time the sun fully cleared, that honest dawn air was gone. Heat came up out of the ground like someone opened an oven door. Flags close to them moved left, flags far out twitched right. The plate softened in the scope as mirage thickened, turning edges into a silver blur. Someone behind them muttered that the window had been there if she'd just taken it. Lauren ignored it. A rushed trigger pull at this distance was a waste. One clean shot meant no guessing. Whitaker walked up, kept his voice low. "We don't force it. Data says stand down when it says stand down." Lauren nodded and lifted her head from the stock. She ejected the round and cleared the chamber. Mason logged environmental changes, Grace saved the wind trace. Dylan scanned high for any slice of steadier air. Nothing worth it. Back at Camp Horizon, skepticism started to move around like smoke. A tech from another section asked if the number was even realistic. A corporal said he knew a guy who hit 2 kilometers and called it the ceiling. None of it mattered. Lauren sat at a folding table and wrote what actually did matter: ground wind variability at dawn worse than forecast, mirage onset earlier than expected, upper layer shear likely. She drew a thin box around, no fire, and underlined it once. Nathan dropped into the chair across from her. "You didn't miss it," he said. "It wasn't there." She gave a short nod. Dylan slid over with the scope log, Mason with ammo notes, Grace with the sensor export. Whitaker stopped by long enough to point at the timeline. "Tomorrow," he said. "Zero theatrics. We treat the air like a closing door." The afternoon turned to validation work. Lauren rechecked torque and zero on a spare plate at a modest distance, not for bragging shots but to confirm nothing had shifted in the gun. Mason cycled 2 rounds across temperature bands and measured velocity swings. Grace walked flags and confirmed what they already suspected: the basin was picking up conflicting currents by mid-morning. By late day, the range looked like a heat mirage factory. Rumors kept going anyway. Somebody said she hesitated. Another said the math was a fairy tale. Nathan shut down 2 conversations with a single look. "You weren't on the glass," he said. "Let the people on the glass do their jobs." When the sun dropped and the air finally cooled, Lauren sat on a crate outside the tent with the notebook open on her knee. She built a simple plan in steady lines: wake earlier, be on glass before first edge of light, commit only inside a verified calm slice, no second guessing. She boxed the number again, 3,827. Not a chant. Just a coordinate for decisions. Grace stepped out, handed over a small slip from the console. "Best 10-minute block yesterday was 6 minutes earlier than today's first stable reading," she said. "We start earlier, we might get a cleaner panel." "Good," Lauren said. Dylan leaned against the post. "We'll put the tripod feet in deeper. No micro shift." Mason nodded. "Ammo's tight. No spread that'll mess you up." Whitaker came by last, hands in pockets, eyes on the horizon line turning purple. "No pressure from upstairs. Just get the air right." Lauren closed the notebook. The camp generator coughed, then settled into a steady thrum. Wind moved lightly across the canvas, not enough to sway the guy lines. She stood, checked her case latches by habit, and looked toward the dark where Echo Valley Range waited. There was no speech to give, no promise to make. Just an early alarm, a clean checklist, and a single decision waiting at first light. Lauren woke before it sounded. The tent was cold and still, canvas barely twitching. She sat up, laced her boots, and let the quiet settle. Outside, the generator hummed low. The sky wasn't even gray yet. Dylan was already moving in the dark, tripod over his shoulder. Mason checked the ammo tote with a red lens light. Grace sipped a sensor pack and nodded once. Nathan fell in at the end of the line, silent as a shadow. No one asked for a pep talk. There wasn't one to give. At the berm, they worked by routine. Tripod feet dug deep. Scope locked. Flags checked along the corridor, one by one. Grace brought the console online, numbers crawled in, pressure flat, temp low, humidity razor thin. Lauren knelt, popped her case, and ran her hands over the rifle like a mechanic over a race engine. Action smooth. Ring set. Bipod steady. Rear bag right where it needed to be. The plate downrange was still just an idea in the dark. They waited for the rim of light. Nathan stood back with Whitaker, both of them hands tucked, faces unreadable. The horizon silvered. Flags near them barely moved. Further out, the middle set drifted a hair, then stopped. Lauren tuned parallax and watched the scene reveal itself an inch at a time. Echo Valley Range slid into view, long flat, low ridge, tiny glint at the very edge where the steel hung. Ground 2, east-northeast, Dylan murmured. Upper unknown. Mirage not yet formed. Lauren did not load. She read the flags again, then shifted her eye to a cluster of sagebrush 2/3 out. It told the truth better than plastic when air brushed across it. Nothing moved. She checked the turret, rolled elevation through the stack, and rested her finger along the trigger guard, not on it. She waited. The first slice of calm came thin and fragile. Grace called it at the console, wind trace nearly flat. Dylan's voice dropped. Window. Lauren exhaled, then let it go. Not clean enough. The far flag trembled once like a heartbeat. She lifted her face from the stock and reset. Behind them, someone from a neighboring lane muttered that it looked good. Nathan didn't turn. He just kept watching the flags, not the clock. The second window teased them. Ground looked steady, but the middle distance whispered left right left, the classic sign of a layer fighting itself. Mirage began as a faint shimmer. Grace adjusted the panel brightness and gave numbers that weren't comforting. Temperature was climbing faster than yesterday. Lauren closed the bolt on an empty chamber and broke the trigger to check for any hitch. Clean. She sat back and waited for the air to settle into an honest line. It didn't. By the time the sun's edge cleared, the basin woke up. The near flags eased right. The far flags drifted left. That sheer would turn a perfect hold into feet of miss. Whitaker kept his distance, but his silence said the same thing: don't waste a round. Lauren ejected the dummy, recentered the rifle, and tightened the bag a touch. Patience felt heavy, but it was the only lever that mattered. Back at camp, the talk had volume now. A crewman said even 2 kilometers was a fantasy for most. Another asked loud enough to be heard whether record chasing was the point. Grace kept her head down over the data. Mason ran case measurements and velocities like he had blinders on. Dylan cleaned glass and didn't look up. Nathan let a minute of noise burn itself out, then cut through it with a flat line: no one speaks for the shot except the shooter. The tent went quiet. The day became a build-out. Grace stitched wind logs from the last 2 mornings and found a pattern: best stability had slid earlier each day. Lauren penciled that into the notebook. She drew a block labeled commit and wrote only one line: inside verified calm slice. No second attempt. Mason checked the hand loads again and nodded at the uniform numbers. Dylan suggested staking a second set of microflags closer together midway to read subcurrents. Whitaker approved with a curt nod and a glance at the map. Afternoon heat turned the range into a mirage factory. Lauren didn't shoot long. She only verified the interface between rifle, optic, and body at a safe training distance. No ego, no audience, just a check that nothing mechanical could betray the plan when the air finally lined up. She returned to the table and rewrote hold estimates, not because the computer couldn't do it, but because writing made her see where assumptions hid. Elevation arc like a thrown spear. Spin drift compounded at time of flight. Coriolis small but real at this azimuth. The math wasn't romantic. It was a recipe. Follow it wrong and dinner burns. Follow it right and the plate sings. Evening cooled the camp. A small moon lifted. The generator settled into that familiar thrum. Nathan stopped by her crate seat and didn't speak for a moment. He watched the horizon the way jumpmasters watch a door. She kept writing. He finally said the only thing that mattered. Air first. Everything else second. She closed the book. Air first, she repeated. Not a mantra, just an order of operations. They turned in early. In the cot's quiet, Lauren replayed the morning in small frames: the almost window, the twitch mid-range, the way the far sheer wrote a lie across the glass. She pictured the correct picture instead: flags aligned like a sentence that makes sense, brush still, shimmer thin, numbers steady. She fell asleep with that film looping, not as hope, but as a checklist item she would either check or not. The alarm never had to ring. She sat up in the dark again, boots on, kit up, case in hand. Outside, Dylan was already at the truck, Mason tapping the tote latch, Grace hugging the console to her chest like it was a fragile instrument, Nathan holding the tailgate without a word. Whitaker stood by the map, face unreadable, only his watch giving away the urgency. They rolled out under a sky that hadn't decided to be morning yet. At the berm, they moved like they had done this for years together. Tripod planted. Scope locked. Flags walked. Sensor set. Lauren laid the rifle down and leveled it. She breathed once and let the air out slow. The horizon was still a thin bruise. She adjusted parallax to nothing and checked eye relief. The plate was an idea again, not a picture, and that was fine. She wasn't chasing a picture. She was arranging the conditions for a truth to happen. The first hint of gray showed. The near flags did nothing. The mid flags did nothing. The far flags, she waited and watched, did nothing. Grace's trace flattened. Dylan's voice turned almost inaudible. Window. Lauren didn't load yet. She watched another 5 seconds, then another 5, hunting for the wobble that would betray the layer. Nothing. She eased around into the chamber, set the bolt forward, and let the rifle become part of her bones. The hold existed on paper and in her head. She let it settle into her hands. The air was finally speaking one language. Now all that remained was to answer it without a single wasted motion. Lauren sank a fraction deeper behind the stock, let her cheek settle until the scope's eye box was perfect, and felt the rifle line up with her spine like a straight beam. The world narrowed to the reticle and the long corridor of air that finally spoke in one clean direction. Near flags quiet. Mid flags quiet. Far flags, still quiet. Grace's trace held flat. Dylan's breath was barely there. Nathan and Whitaker stayed a few paces back, present but out of the shot's gravity. The plate a horizon speck, silver against a thin band of new light. No pageantry. No speech. Just the job. She ran through the checklist without words. Elevation where the math said it had to live. Wind on the edge of modest, held with the tiniest bias to insurance. Spin drift already baked in. Coriolis accounted for, small, but it mattered when flight time turned seconds into stories. She watched the shimmer, thin as a veil, not a wall, and waited through 2 slow breaths to see if it lied. It did not. Ground 2 east, Dylan whispered. Mid trace steady. Far trace steady. Window is good. Lauren found the hold, let the reticle settle, and did the thing she always did when everything lined up. She didn't rush. She let her heart fall into a softer beat, let her lungs move like careful machinery, and put the pad of her finger on the trigger the way you place a glass on a table you don't want to scratch. The rifle became weight and bone. The scope became a window with no frame. She exhaled and paused. No hero thought. No imagined headline. Just cause and effect across open distance. The press was a slow roll, straight back, no side pressure, no anticipation. The break was clean, a click turning into a snap that lived more in her finger than in sound. The rifle recoiled and came home into the bag like it had practiced this one moment for years. She rode it, stayed on glass, and never blinked. The bullet left with a supersonic crack that thinned in the cold air. Then came the part most shooters never learn to live with, the weight that stretches time. 1 second. 2. The reticle held on the plate's ghost. 3. The mind wants to fill that space with doubt. Lauren didn't let it. 4. Somewhere between here and there, a layer could shift. 4.5. The flags held. 5. 6. The horizon didn't move, but something inside the shimmer twitched like a string plucked once. A bright, thin ping came back faint as a memory, traveling across the flat like a secret. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was a fact. Steel touched by copper after a long arc through math and air. The plate rocked a fraction. The far flags ignored it. The desert absorbed it. No one spoke first because no one trusted their own ears. Then Dylan exhaled a breath he'd been holding for days. Mason's pencil stopped mid-scratch. Grace's screen froze on numbers that suddenly meant something more than digits. Whitaker didn't smile so much as allow the corners of his eyes to soften. Nathan didn't move at all. He watched Lauren, not the target. She ran the bolt once, smooth and quiet, and left the chamber empty. She didn't pump a fist. She didn't look for a witness. She wrote in her notebook, the same hand that had written 100 smaller notes, 3,827. Temp low 40s. Ground 2 east. Trace steady. Mirage light. Impact confirmed. She boxed it and underlined once. Data, not drama. Behind them, a lane chief from another team swore softly. Someone else whispered, "No way," as if arguing with the sound would make it take itself back. Dylan kept his voice level, like calling a landing. Impact. Plate rocked. Call it. Grace saved the slice of trace and timestamped the window. Mason closed the ammo case like the lid on a finished equation. Only then did Lauren lift her face from the scope. She wiped a small line of dust off the stock, checked the bipod's bite in the berm, and snapped the caps onto the turret like a curtain closing. Nathan stepped in and crouched at her side, not too close. His voice carried no applause, just recognition. "That's the shot." She nodded once. The moment didn't grow or shrink. It stayed the size it needed to be. Whitaker approached with the measured steps of someone who'd seen claims come and go. He didn't ask if it happened. He asked for the record, time, conditions, settings. Lauren gave him the numbers. He gave her a short, clean nod, the kind that stands in for a ceremony no one here wanted. In the silence that followed, the desert returned to being a place instead of a witness. The light climbed. Heat began to lift off the surface in thin sheets, warning them that the door they'd slipped through was already closing. Dylan scanned the plate a last time, saw the slight tilt still settling, and packed the scope. Grace powered down the console and tucked the data like something that could be lost if the wind took it. Mason taped the ammo box and wrote a single word on the lid, "Done." Words started moving before the truck even rolled. A range hand jogged 2 lanes over and said, "I think it hit." Another said, "I heard it." A third said, "You can't hear that far." The argument didn't touch the team. Nathan guided them toward the bed of the truck with 2 simple gestures. Whitaker stayed by the berm long enough to mark the time on his clipboard and look once more downrange like a man checking a door is locked. In the truck, the ride back felt shorter than the drive out. The sun was rising into clearer gold. Camp Horizon came into view, the same tents, the same antennas, but now with a new current moving through them. At the table, Lauren set the rifle case down and cracked it open to let the barrel breathe. She pulled a fresh cloth and wiped dust from the stock not because it mattered to anyone else, but because it mattered to her. Ritual before. Ritual after. Mason slid a log sheet under her notebook. Grace placed a printed trace on top of it. Dylan dropped a short list of what he'd seen through glass, written in block letters. None of them said congratulations. None of them needed to. The team's language was work. Across camp, voices trickled, then pooled. People asked the wrong questions, how it felt, what it meant, who would write it up. Whitaker shut down a cluster with a dry line, "Ask the data." Nathan fielded a few stares with the same flat calm he brought to raids. He let the myth chasers drift past. Lauren finished with the cloth, checked the action one more time, and closed the case. She sat for a breath, not to replay the shot, but to let the noise of camp pass around her until it thinned. Then she stood, took the notebook, and drew a small arrow from today's box to a blank space on the next page. Not a new target. Not yet. Just a place to put the next honest problem when it arrived. Behind her, the desert wind picked up like it remembered itself. The flags along the range line found their small disagreements. The window was gone. The shot was already part of the morning like footprints you can't see once the light gets harsh. Nathan looked up at the ridge and then at Lauren. She looked back once, steady as ever. No smile. No frown. Just that same quiet that had carried a bullet farther than most people thought sense would allow. That same quiet carried back into Camp Horizon with them, steady as a heartbeat while the rest of the camp tried to decide how loud to be. Voices gathered in pockets. Someone said you couldn't possibly hear a plate ring from that far. Someone else swore they saw the target tilt. None of it changed what the team had in front of them: numbers, timestamps, and a clean sequence of steps that led to a single, deliberate press. Lauren set her case on the table, popped the latches, and let the barrel breathe. She wiped dust from the stock, checked the action, and laid the notebook beside the cloth like a receipt for the morning. Whitaker moved first. He took the data as if he were handing it to an audit: Grace's wind trace with the flat band circled, Mason's ammo log with lot, temp, and velocity spread marked tight, Dylan's glass notes written in square block letters, near flags, mid flags, far flags, all consistent. He didn't add adjectives. He didn't need them. He asked Lauren for settings, elevation, wind hold, any bias added for insurance. She answered in numbers. He wrote them into a form that looked like it had been waiting for this moment since the program was drafted. Word kept seeping. A crew from another range came by with questions built more on curiosity than doubt. Did you hold high or dial at all? How much drift did you feed in? What about Coriolis at that azimuth? Nathan stood where he could be heard without raising his voice. We followed the plan, he said. Air first. The rest follows. It wasn't a dodge. It was the whole point distilled. By midday, the desert turned mean again. Heat shimmer ran between tents. The flags at Echo Valley argued with one another the way they always did past first light. Grace pointed a finger at her console, where the clean window they'd used showed as a calm river between jagged banks. You try that an hour later, she said to no one in particular, you turn a sure shot into a coin flip. Mason taped his ammo box closed and wrote the same word he'd written earlier on the lid, done. In the command tent, Whitaker briefed a small circle, no theatrics, just a timeline, conditions, and the outcome. He called it an experiment completed under a validated window with controlled variables and disciplined execution. There was no mention of records. There was no claim beyond what the data could carry. When someone asked if they would run a second shot for confirmation, he didn't look at Lauren for permission. He answered himself. Not in this air, he said. Not for show. Lauren stepped out of the tent and sat on a crate in the shade of a radio mast. The notebook lay open on her knee. She added a short line beneath the boxed entry, post-shot checks normal, no shift in zero, equipment nominal. She didn't replay the ping in her head. She didn't need to. The only echo she cared about was the one on the page. Dylan leaned against the post and flicked grit off the tripod feet. We'll catch heat for not filming it, he said. She didn't shrug or sigh. We caught the shot, she said. That was the end of it. By late afternoon, rumor had outrun fact. Someone said she smiled. Someone said she refused a handshake. Someone said the wind had picked up right as she broke the trigger and the bullet curved anyway, like a trick. Nathan walked through most of it like it was rain, felt, noted, ignored. He stopped only when a young sergeant asked if the team would present to a group in the evening. No demos, he said. This isn't a clinic. The sergeant started to argue and then decided against it. They packed with the same order they had unpacked. Scope caps on. Sensors stowed. Ammo sealed. The truck rolled to the strip as the light softened toward evening. On the tarmac, Whitaker shook Lauren's hand with a grip that said professional, not celebratory. You gave me what I asked for, he said. Nothing more. Nothing less. Grace handed her a printout she didn't have to keep. She kept it anyway, tucked between pages in the notebook like a pressed leaf. Mason tapped the box lid once with his knuckle. Dylan strapped the tripod down so it wouldn't shift in flight. Inside the aircraft, the team settled into the same seats they'd used on the way in. The drone of the engines filled the gaps where other units would have inserted speeches. Lauren rested her palm on the case lid, feeling the faint rattle of the airframe. She thought about the armory bench at Fort Ridgewell, about the order of parts on cold steel, about how ritual made space for decisions. She didn't think about attention, or credit, or what would happen to the story once it left people who were there. Stories were wind, they shifted. The page would keep its shape. Back at Fort Ridgewell, night had already taken the parade ground. The armory smelled the same, oil, steel, dust settled in corners. The light over her bench hummed like it always did. Lauren laid the case down, opened it, and returned to what had always come before and after. Cloth. Bore. Bolt. Lugs. Latch. The rhythm slowed her heartbeat more than sleep could have. Nathan came by the door and didn't step in. "Command will ask," he said. "They'll want a line, maybe a briefing." She replaced the bolt and locked it home with a smooth, even push. "You can give them mine," she said. He understood that meant numbers, nothing else. In the mess the next day, men she didn't know looked up, looked away, and then looked back. One asked Dylan what brand of scope she used. Another asked Mason if he'd share his hand-load recipe. Grace offered a polite no without apology. Whitaker sent a file up the chain with the same flat tone he'd used on the range. If there was a reply, it would be later and short. Lauren's bench stayed the same. The notebook gained one more page anchored by a thin, neat box. The armory door kept opening and closing. The base kept moving in its loops. If there was a lesson hanging in the air, it wasn't about glory. It was simpler. Respect the variables. Respect the ritual. Respect the silence that lets you hear when the air finally says now. When a private drifted close and asked what it felt like, she aligned the bolt lugs with the receiver and said, "It felt like the math was right." He nodded as if he expected something else and walked away a little taller anyway. In the following week, the questions didn't stop, they just changed shape. Would she try again? Would she teach a class? Would she sit for an interview? No, no, and no. Nathan fielded most of it with a single phrase, "We're working." And they were. They returned to drills that never made it to rumor, rough wind holds at modest ranges, quick dope checks at noon, spotter-shooter cadence until it rang like a metronome. The extraordinary lived beside the ordinary, and the ordinary still paid the bills. One evening, Lauren stood just outside the armory as the sun slid down behind the trees, turning the air the same quiet gold it had been on that Nevada morning. She didn't try to connect the two. She simply breathed, felt the weight of the rifle case in her hand, and let the day end. Somewhere in Nevada, a plate held a small mark only a few would notice if they walked right up to it. Somewhere on this base, a rumor congealed into a story and then into a myth. Neither thing needed her. She flipped the light off over her bench and closed the door softly. The hallway was empty, clean, ordinary. The quiet followed, not because the world gave it to her, but because she carried it. And if anything in this whole process had changed, it was only that more people now knew what that quiet could do when the air aligned and a single decision met it at exactly the right second. That was the part people kept missing when they tried to turn the story into something else. Lauren returned to work like she always did, armory light, bench clear, parts laid out in the same order. The base moved on. Formations at dawn. Engines on the flight line. Radios clicking in short bursts. If the shot lived anywhere, it lived in the way a routine felt heavier and simpler at the same time. Nathan stopped by less often, not because he'd lost interest, but because there wasn't anything to guard anymore. The team had done the work. The rest was noise. News tried to find its way in. A liaison asked if she would sit down for a recorded lessons learned. She said no. Not out of secrecy, but because a microphone could not record the only part that mattered, waiting without flinching when the window was thin. A training unit requested a demo at noon in gusting wind. Whitaker answered for her before she had to. "Bad air," he said. "Wrong hour." The request faded. On the range at Fort Ridgewell, ordinary drills filled the board. Dylan set steel at practical distances and called wind the way spotters do when no one is watching. Mason tuned loads for consistency across weather swings and wrote small notes that would never be quoted anywhere. Grace sent an email thread with a graph that showed dawn stability sliding 10 minutes earlier across 3 days and added a line, "Don't fight the sun." Whitaker closed his report to hire with 2 sentences that would never trend, "Objective met inside validated window." Recommend no repetition for optics. A private from another company found Lauren at the bench and stood there like he was at a counter ordering something he couldn't name. "Ma'am," he said, "if you had to tell me one thing, just one, to get better with a rifle, what would it be?" She checked the thread pitch on a screw with her thumbnail and looked at him long enough that he almost apologized for asking. "Make your checks boring," she said. Boring turns into clean. Clean turns into repeatable. Repeatable turns into calm. He waited for more. There wasn't more. He wrote it down anyway and looked relieved, like someone had just handed him a map instead of a speech. Rumor did what rumor always does. It got taller and thinner at the same time. Someone swore the bullet took 9 seconds. Someone swore there were 2 impacts. Someone said the plate shattered. None of that lived on paper. The paper had a box with a number and a date and 3 small conditions underlined once. Nathan heard a staff sergeant in a chow line say the whole thing was theater and didn't bother to turn around. Theater needed an audience. The only audience that morning had been a set of flags and a piece of steel. A week later, Whitaker walked into the armory with a folder. He set it on the bench without drama. "Admin closed," he said. She nodded and slid the folder under the bench with the other finished things, inspection slips, range cards, practical checklists. He didn't add anything about recognition or credit. She didn't either. He paused, like there might be a human moment to pull out and hold up to the light, then decided against it. "Carry on," he said, and left. The team took one last trip to Nevada, not to shoot, but to collect hardware and sign off on equipment transfer. Echo Valley felt smaller in daylight without purpose. The ridge was the same. The flats were the same. The flags were down. No console hummed. No crate sat at the berm. They drove out in a beat-up truck with no ceremony and stopped where the firing line used to be. Dylan pointed his chin at the horizon like he could still see the corridor they'd used. Mason stepped off a few paces in silence and came back without comment. Grace walked to the plate with a wrench because someone had to carry it back. Up close, the metal wore a faint mark, not dramatic, not centered, just there. She ran her thumb over it and said nothing. Nathan watched the 4 of them and let the quiet do the talking. They loaded the plate and strapped it down. No one took a picture. The truck bounced back toward the strip. On the radio, the range control voice sounded like every range control voice on every base, practical, clipped, uninterested in stories. At Camp Horizon, a new unit had already pitched tents where their tables had been. One of the newcomers asked if the place was good for long shots. At dawn, Dylan said. "If you listen." Back home, Lauren's notebook got a new elastic band because the old one had stretched out. Pages didn't care what people said. Pages cared what you wrote. She added a line on the inside cover that wasn't about records or legend. Air first. Don't force it. She closed the book and slid it into her case where it always lived, front slot, spine toward the handle, pencil tucked at the top. Nathan caught her in the hallway a day later. He leaned against the doorframe like it might hold him up if the right word didn't come. "They'll ask again," he said. "Somebody always asks again." She waited. He nodded like he'd answered himself and pushed off the frame. "Same answer," he said. Not in bad air. She almost smiled. "Almost." "Same answer," she said back. A month rolled by. Training cycles did what they do, start, peak, reset. New faces came through. Old faces rotated out. If the story traveled with them, it traveled as something men told on a bus to a different field, shaved down to a hook and a punchline. The armory light still hummed. The bore still caught a thin film of oil. The bolt still slid home with a sound that told a trained ear it had locked straight. Lauren's hands still moved the same way they had before anybody asked anything about 3827. One evening, she stepped outside as the base fell into that half-light between loud and quiet. The air in North Carolina didn't feel like Nevada air, but it had its own calm if you stood still long enough. She thought about nothing specific, about screws that like to back out, about glass that needs a wipe, about how the first cold front of fall makes people shoot high if they don't pay attention. She thought about the window, not as a miracle but as a thing that appears and vanishes on a schedule you can respect if you're honest. Inside, a private scrubbed carbon off a bolt face like he was trying to erase a mistake. She took the brush and showed him slower strokes, less pressure, better angle. He copied it. The bolt turned clean in 7 passes instead of 20. Boring, he said. Good, she said. He laughed once like the answer had surprised him. If there was a lesson, it was not that anything is possible if you believe hard enough. It was that some things are possible when you pay attention long enough. The desert didn't applaud. The bass didn't throw a party. The steel didn't care. The air certainly didn't. But for a thin slice of time, variables lined up and a person who had practiced being calm stayed calm. That was the whole story without makeup. People kept asking Nathan what she had that other shooters didn't. He told them nothing they wanted to hear. She waits, he said. And she doesn't guess. They stared like he'd skipped the good part. He hadn't. There wasn't a good part beyond that. There was only the part that works. On a Sunday with no schedule, Lauren sat on the edge of her bunk with the case open and the notebook in her lap. She flipped to the boxed entry and drew a tiny check mark in the margin, not to celebrate but to close the loop. Then she turned the page to a clean sheet and wrote a fresh header without a number. She didn't know what would go there yet, another task, another distance, some smaller problem that mattered to someone else. The size didn't matter. The process would be the same. She closed the case, shut off the light over the bench, and pulled the door quietly behind her. The hallway carried the usual echoes. The bass was the bass. Out on the parade ground, the flag leaned once and then went still. Somewhere very far away, a plate sat on a table in a warehouse with a faint mark that would mean nothing to most eyes and everything to a few. That was enough. The work had spoken. The silence had carried. And when the next window came, here, somewhere else, different target, she would do what she always did, lay out the parts, listen for the air, and answer when the second was exactly right.